7 times 27 times 9. That's a lot. You can make, just from this, 30,000 different versions of your B cell receptor. But that's got to pair with a light chain. Well, the light chain has about 1,000. Now here's the thing. You've got to pair a light chain with a heavy chain, and that can change what that's going to be recognizing. And if you do that, you get more than 36 million different combinations. And so we're starting to get to the level of being able to recognize lots and lots of stuff. But there's one more step. When you put these joints together, when you do a V to J, or D to J, or D to D to J, puts a sloppy joint there. It sort of introduces sloppiness into the process so that you get much higher numbers. And the current estimate is somewhere around 10 to the 20th different combinations. Okay? So, we talked before about the hypervariable 1 and 2 regions and the hypervariable 3 regions. These correspond to the part of the antibody that recognizes antigen. So the HBR1 corresponds to complementarity determined region 1. HBR1 is CDR1. HBR2 is CDR2. HBR3 is CDR3. HBR1 and 2 are encoded by whatever V gene segment you use. So if you have a set of antibodies that all have V1, or V heavy 1, they all have identical CDR1 and 2 or HBR1 and 2. If you have a light chain that's using V kappa 2, all the B cells that use V kappa 2 have the same HBR1 and 2. It's just encoded by whichever gene segment that B cell picked. The HBR3 has the most diversity and is not germline encoded. HBR3 is really the part that is sloppily joined together, and that's because it occurs at the joint. When you stick a V and J together, the CDR3 or HBR3 is that joint where you stuck them together. And so if you make that joint really sloppy, you get lots and lots of possibilities for that HBR3. So if you have two B cell clones that use the same variable and light, they have the same HBR1 and 2, but a different HBR3. Okay? And if you look at this, right, the HBR1 and 2 are just whatever V gene segment you picked, but the HBR3 is this joint between, in this case, a heavy chain, V, D, and J. And when you look at the actual part of the antibody, these are from the gene segment, HBR1 and HBR2, but this is the part where you get the most diversity. And usually, most antibodies are sort of heavy on the HBR3 for what they recognize. Because the HBR1 and 2 can get you closer. HBR3 is really the key to antigen specificity. And therefore, it's the most diverse. Right? You want to be able to recognize anything that comes into your body, so you want to have lots and lots of different ones. At least once a time. So what's happening is that you're putting these sequences together, right? And this is all controlled by something called the RSSs. Not a Princess Bride reference. This is recombination signal sequences. These tell the B cell which ones you can stick together. Because you don't want to start messing this up and give yourself a lymphoma or myeloma, right? You want to stick these together. And this is controlled by an RSS. And it's basically, there's two kinds. You have a 7 nucleotide sequence with a 23 nucleotide spanning, and then a 9 nucleotide sequence. That can only pair with a 9 nucleotide sequence that has a 12 nucleotide spacer and a half point. Why 12 and 23? Any ideas? Any structural biochemists there? How many terms of DNA is that? I'll give you a hint. It's a round number. This is one term of DNA, and this is two terms. And so really, it's matching up these two sequences over here, but you have to have this sort of bulge. Okay, so it's sort of sticking these two, the heptamers and the monomers together. But then if you've got a different number of spacers, it creates sort of a bulge in the DNA, and that allows the enzymes that cleave the DNA to recognize that, yes, I can join these together. Okay, so the 7-mer sort of gets paired together here and here, and it forms a hairpin. It's got this big loop, right? And then the monomers pair up here, and so you've got this bulge that can be recognized. And the rule is you can only recombine an RSS that has a 12 nucleotide sequence with an RSS that has a 23 nucleotide sequence. Okay, so if you look in your alpha chain, or sorry, in your lambda chain, you have, these are your two light chains. These V's can only pair with these J's. And luckily for you, the kappa chain is on a different chromosome. So only these V's can pair with these J's. And so you limit the amount of damage you can do. But now here's for the antibodies, there's an issue, right? You've got to do a D to J first. Well, that's okay. You've got 23 here and a 12 there. So you can get that bulge and recognize that difference in the DNA. Once that happens, you've still got 23s and 12s. It's a highly regulated process, but you can only put these joints together. When we get to T-cell recombination, there's another twist that they get to do multiple times. Okay, so the 12-23 rule. I'm for sure going to ask you on the test, what is the 12-23 rule? It is you can only put together a gene segment that has a 12 nucleotide spacer RSS with a gene segment that has a 23 nucleotide spacer RSS. Okay, it seems like, well, that really is a weird process, but this is because you don't want to just start grabbing random bits of DNA, because that's how you get chromosomal translocations in cancer. Okay. So what happens? Okay, so the first thing is you sort of form this hairpin. And we show it in cartoons as one of these is happening, but in fact you have all of that DNA encoding all those gene segments is stuck together in these big loops of DNA. And their RSSs are recognized by the recombination activation genes. Okay? The somatic recombination is essentially the same process every time. A B cell can do this at least 4 times. Lambda chain, kappa chain, and for the heavy chain you have to do it twice. B to J and B to B to J. There's at least 4 possibilities. Every B cell has to do it minimum of 3 times. Got to do 1 light chain, 2 B to J, and 2 for the heavy chain. The first thing is the RAG enzymes are coming in to bind those RSSs. Now what a B cell is really doing is intentionally damaging its DNA and in the process of repairing it, creating a new sequence. But only these cells do this. So they have some unique proteins, the recombination activation genes 1 and 2, terminal deoxynucleotide transferase, Artemis, and all the other ones are just DNA repair enzymes. Okay? It's not your classical helicase unwinding repair. This is different. Okay? So what's happening is the RAG proteins bind to the 12 and 23 RSSs. In reality, it's RAG1 that's binding them, because RAG2 is the enzyme that cuts them. RAG1 gets to come and say, I decide which gene segments to put together. RAG2 says, okay, you picked, now we're going to cut them. And the RAG2 proteins cleave to the DNA, but what happens is you have nucleophilic attack, and you just form, the hairpin closes in on itself. So you make a sort of a loop at the top. Okay? Then you have these proteins, KU70 and KU80, which we just always call 7080, that kind of come together and stabilize this. And it's not clear if they're really making the hairpin or if they're just holding it there to make the hairpin happen, but they're doing this on both pieces of DNA. Because remember, the RAG proteins bound to these RSSs and they cut them. So you've snipped off a section of DNA That's then held together with this Ku78 band-aid. It's holding the ends. But it's also holding, these proteins are also on the part that you cut out. And your B cells treat these differently. For the part you cut out, you don't care about this, but you also don't want to have free DNA ends floating around, particularly in your nucleus. So you want to seal that up. It's just a way of getting rid of this. Eventually you're going to degrade it. The whole point is that part you cut out, you throw it away, but you want to make it safe, so you don't want to have it recombine with your DNA. And if you just left open ends, that would probably happen. So all that really happens is you get DNA ligase 4, comes in and seals the ends. And now you've got a circular piece of DNA in your B cells. If you want to look at newly formed B cells, they all have something like this floating around in their cytoplasm. And so you can identify really young B cells, if you want to think of them that way, because they haven't degraded this piece of DNA. Now notice, this is a precise joint, meaning I didn't add any nucleotides, I didn't introduce this sloppiness. And that's because you don't need to. Why would you bother? You're going to throw it away anyways, right? Okay, so most of the time, what's happening, the Ig heavy and light gene segments occur in the same orientation, but a few actually occur in the opposite orientation, meaning instead of course looking like this and you're going to cleave out what's in between, they're actually the same way and you actually make an inversion. That happens too. If they're from the same orientation, meaning they're pointing at each other, you get an excision circle. If it's in opposite orientation, meaning pointing the same way, then you get an inversion. I don't care that you know what an inversion looks like. Think of this just as excision circles, because that's what usually happens. There's only like 2 B segments that are in the opposite orientation. So most of the time, this is what's happening. And this is what I would like you to remember. Okay, but now you still want to make that HVR3. And you want to make it a sloppy joint, right? And so you have the Ku7080 proteins are bound to this, and they form little loops of DNA. And this is the first step of making this sloppy. Is there's a protein called DNA PKCS that comes in and activates Artemis. So DNA PKCS is a kinase. It phosphorylates Artemis. Artemis becomes activated, and Artemis is going to cleave this another time. So you think about it, you've made a loop, right, of DNA. Well, if I cut it here, I'm going to get a long arm. If I cut it at the top of the loop, I'm going to get 2 even arms. If I cut it over here, I'll get a long arm at this side. So those sequences, that's the first step of diversity. Wherever Artemis cuts, can make a different sequence on the other side. Okay, so that's the first step. PKCS phosphorylates Artemis, and it cleaves the hairpin at a random site. Now remember, this is a hairpin. Because of that, whatever you fold out is going to be a palindrome. And so if anybody's ever said P nucleotides, this is the first step of diversity, is palindromic nucleotides. So that part that you form a hairpin, you cut down here and you flop it out, the sequence is going to be the reverse complement, or it's going to be the opposite of this sequence, because it paired together at the beginning. Now something special happens. Now you have a protein called terminal deoxynucleotide transferase that just comes in and brazenly adds random nucleotides to the ends of those P nucleotides. Okay? They are not templated. There's no templated here. It's just one of the few enzymes that can see a piece of DNA and start adding nucleotides to the end of it. Okay? Those are non-templated nucleotides. So first we have the P nucleotides from where Artemis cut, and now TDT is going to add some nucleotides to the end of that. Those are non-templated N nucleotides. So if you were to draw a joint between between a variable region and a joining region, a V to J, you would have P nucleotides on each side and N nucleotides in the middle. Now what's happening is you add a bunch of these, and then the exonucleases come in at the ends and start trimming them off. And we'll go through a little bit how that looks. But you add some, and then you take away some, and eventually you get filled in by, there's a enzyme that fills in the rest of the nucleotides, and then you just have DNA ligase 4 comes in and seals the joint. By doing that, you've added between 9 and 30 nucleotides. You just made that a whole different CDR3 or HBR3. Change what the antibody recognizes. So, the coding sequence for your B-cell receptor, the part you want to keep that's still in the genome, has an imprecise joint or a sloppy joint. The signal sequence, the part you cut out, that has the RSSs stuck to it still, has a precise joint. Okay, so now we said you've got these palindromic sequences, right? So Artemis has cut the DNA, or sorry, this is where you get the RSSs brought together, the RAG proteins cut it, you get a hairpin, and then Artemis cuts that again, and you get these palindromes. Now, that means that A, T, this has to be the reverse of that, A and T, right? So this T was originally paired with this A was originally paired with that T, and that's how you get a palindrome. Meaning it's the same backwards or forwards. So this side will be the exact same as this side. Now you start, this second step is adding non-templated nucleotides. That's TDT. Comes in and just adds random ones. And at some point, you get some pairing there, sort of micro pairing. And the exonucleases come and chew off the ones that are at the end that don't pair very well. Now, you don't really need that much pairing to get some pieces of the DNA to stick together by hydrogen bonds. Once you do that, then you have DNA enzymes that come and add in these missing pieces, and eventually DNA ligase seals the gap there. Okay? So if you look here, you have P nucleotides. This actually should go all the way over here, right? P nucleotides on both sides, and then non-templated nucleotides in the middle. Those are your P and N nucleotides. This is another way of looking at it, right? Is that here's our hairpins that are formed after RAG cuts the ends off, make the hairpin, and then depending where Artemis cuts this, it's not always going to cut right here at the end, it's just for illustration, and you get these P nucleotides. Then you're going to fill in with non-templated nucleotides in the middle. The exonuclease removes the ones that are not going to match together, and then you just fill in the rest. So those are your palindromic sequences, and then these are your non-templated sequences. Okay, so let's do an activity, and I need volunteers. If nobody volunteers, then I'm going to pick volunteers. Yeah, come on down. Right, the front row is always going to get picked for volunteers. Okay. You guys can sit in the front row. I actually should say 80. One more? Oh, two more. Okay. Teresa, will you help me? And one more volunteer. Don't worry, you don't have to wear a label.
We can put it back. I'm sorry.
All right, so here we have our DNA. Okay, we've got a segment of DNA. Is this heavy or light chain? Light chain. It's only got V and J segments, right? I also have lambda here, in case there's any question. So, who's the first proteins that come in? RAG proteins, okay? Who recognizes which gene segment? Rag 1 chooses which ones you're going to cut. So you have to choose. Okay, and you get to choose both. So you want to choose one V and one J. Don't worry, there's no penalty if you get it wrong.
The V4 and the J2.
Okay, so I want you to stand behind there. You guys are going to come in again. Okay, so what does rag 1 do with those? Like, feel good moment, it brings them together. So pull them, which ones you want to recombine together. Okay? That's the first step. What's the second step?
Rag 2 comes in. And
Rag 2 comes in and cuts them. Which you cut just here on the RSSs. Does rag 2 cut both of them?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so you've cut the RSSs from one side. We'll go on the other side. Sorry, switch the RSSs. You've got to cut both of them on this side. Okay, there's not a penalty here. Okay. Is this the coding sequence or the joint sequence?
Joint.
This is the joint sequence, right? It's got the RSSs still at the ends. Who recognizes this? KU 70 and 80. Sorry, that should be, one of those should be 80. Okay, what is your job?
To take those.
Just to hold them. Okay? Who's next? Who has the next job here? DNA ligase. Come on in, ligase. What is DNA ligase's job?
Seal it together.
Just tie them together. So this is just, right, DNA repair. You don't make any nucleotides. Go ahead and tie them together. I don't care how you do it, just any old way. We're not going to get that deep into the interpretive dance that we're doing here. Okay. So now this is the joint, the non-coding sequence. You dump that out in the cytoplasm and eventually gets degraded, recycled, and uses up. Okay? So now we've got this. Who comes over here? This is the coding sequence. Wait. You need the KU 70 and 80 proteins still. They're the ones that hold it. Now what's happening to these ends? Yes?
So while they're holding those other, the non-coding, they're also holding this at the same time?
This is a different set. These are their
Oh, these
identical
are their
twins.
friends, they're like, okay. These are like their other homies that they drink with it.
You found the hole in my dramatic process, okay? What happens to these ends? Remember our P nucleotides? These ends form a little loop. Now I'm going to do this because this is just a chemistry reaction. Maybe a loop. It's not an enzymatic action, it's just nucleophilic attack.
So it does that on its own?
It does it on its own. Maybe. Okay? Those are the loops. Who's next? DNA PKCS. What is your job? What does DNA PKCS do? You phosphorylate Artemis, and you give him the license to cut the DNA at a random site in that hairpin. Okay, so for both of these hairpins, you have to pick where you're going to cut the DNA. Okay, so this bit, this overhang here, those are the P nucleotides. It's palindromic because it was a hairpin Now it's flopped open, it reads the same way backwards and forwards. Okay? Thanks. Now whose job? Who's next?
TDT.
TDT. What is TDT's job? Those are random nucleotides. Okay? So you're going to add those to the end. So do we add them all the way? We've got to add some from this side and some from that side. Well, you've got to start adding them. It's not your job to cut them off. So you just add some there. We'll give you some to the other side. Okay? So TDT starts adding non-templated nucleotides. So go ahead and tie it on there. Onto the end of the P nucleotides. Let's get this right. Let's tie that in on the top there. Yes, we do lots of arts and crafts in this class. Now it's tough to see the P nucleotides because this is yarn and we've tied knots in it and lost the link, but okay. Does TDT do anything else? No. Whose job is it now? So you add up these nucleotides and you start, oh, there's a part that matches here. And the nuclease has to come in and do what? Cut these other ends. Oops. You guys need to come closer together. Okay? Scissors. So your job is to cut these parts that are overhanging. So about there, about there. We have parts that match up in the middle. Okay? This is all DNA you're going to recycle and use for other stuff. Now whose job is it? DNA ligase comes in. Now, in reality, what happens is you have a polymerase mu that actually adds all these other nucleotides, right? I need that back. I guess I'll have to add a mu to it. But it adds right? It starts adding nucleotides to fill in the gaps. I'll play the part of the polymerase here. On this side, and it's going to add nucleotides to the other side. Okay, so in reality, you have this polymerase that adds in the missing ones. And now it's DNA ligase's turn to seal these ends. Listen. So what we've done now is we've got a V and a J stuck together. And in between them, we added lots of nucleotides, some random sequence. Depending on where Artemis cut the loop, depending on what nucleotides TDT added, depending on which nucleotides exonuclease chewed away. Now, a question for you. How many nucleotides are in the middle? Has to be a multiple of what? Say that again? It has to be a multiple of 3. Now some could be as short as 3 nucleotides. Usually that's not the case because you need this part that sort of overlaps. 3 nucleotides is usually not enough. The typical length of this is about 27, 30 nucleotides. That's 9 or 10 amino acids, right? Has to be a multiple of 3 because they're codons. And if you don't have a multiple of 3, that puts this out of frame, and now it doesn't work anymore. All right, thank you for the volunteers. Okay, so that is somatic recombination. In a B cell, that happens multiple times during B cell development. But that's not all of B cell development. You sort of have all of these steps. This is one part of it. Okay? So when you think about it, what's happening in a B cell is this process of rearrange the genes, test if that worked. If it does, you get to go to the next step. If it didn't work, meaning you don't get a functional protein because that joint is out of frame or something happened, then you don't get to go on, and that B cell will die. Okay, so your genes, your kappa and lambda, are on different chromosomes than your heavy. Okay, but because they're on different chromosomes, you can regulate which one's getting recombined at what time in B cell development. If they were all at the same point, it would be tough to say, don't just do the heavy chain genes and not the light chain genes. Okay, so you have, if you think about it, a cell has 6 of these. 6 fingers on one hand. 6, because it has 2 of each of these chromosomes. So you have to make sure, because that B cell is only one B cell receptor, can only express one heavy and one light chain. You have to control this. The problem is, there's 2 copies of each one, and you don't have any control over which chromosome is getting recombined, really. And so what happens is, instead of doing that, you're going to have this solution where I'm going to do heavy chains first, test if that heavy chain recombined and produced the functional protein, and if it didn't, I'm going to go back and try it again until I run out of genes. In our example here, we had at most 4 tries at this, right? You did the first 2 together. If that didn't work, you do the next 2. That didn't work, you do the next 2. That didn't work, you get the next 2. So although we think of this as a really inefficient process, you get lots of shots at this. Okay. So remember, B cells develop in the bone marrow, right? That's where the hematopoietic stem cells are. And so you start this process here after you're committed to the common lymphoid progenitor. What has to happen? We have to get an IGH, the heavy chain rearranging. You have to test if that was a productive rearrangement, meaning that joint was a multiple of 3, so that you're in frame with your codons. If that's a yes, you go to 3. If no, you go back to 1. If that was productive, then you do